USS Juno, CL-52, Atlanta-class light cruiser. Commissioned February 14, 1942. Valentine's Day, as if the Navy was trying to be poetic. 541 feet of steel, 10 5-inch guns, 16 1.1-inch anti-aircraft barrels, a crew complement of 673 men. She was fast, she was modern, and she was sent to the Solomon Islands, which in late 1942 was the most dangerous stretch of ocean on the surface of the Earth. On November 13, 1942, a single Japanese Type 95 torpedo struck Juno near her keel, directly beneath her forward fire room. She detonated in approximately 20 seconds. 20 seconds. The torpedo had ignited her forward ammunition magazine. There was no fighting the fire. There was no damage control response. There was no time to respond to anything at all. Of 673 men aboard, 115 survived the initial explosion and made it into the water. The surviving American ships in Task Group 67.4 did not stop. They continued their engagement. They maintained radio silence to avoid alerting Japanese submarines. They followed orders, because those were tactically correct orders to follow. 8 days later, a PBY Catalina located 10 survivors. Not 115, 10. The rest had died in the water. Exposure, wounds, sharks, despair. All 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa went down with her or died afterward in the water. 5 brothers from one family, one ship. 20 seconds. That is the beginning of the story of cruiser service in World War II. Not the version in the recruiting posters. The version where you understand exactly what kind of ship you were climbing aboard, what it was going to ask of you, and what the realistic odds were that you would ever climb off it again. To understand what life on a heavy cruiser actually meant, you have to start with what a heavy cruiser actually was. Not in the abstract sense of naval classification, but in the physical, material sense of what the ship consisted of and what it demanded from the men inside it. A Baltimore-class heavy cruiser, the most capable American cruiser design of the war, measured 673 feet from bow to stern. Displacement at full combat load ran to approximately 17,000 tons. She carried 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 12 5-inch dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns, dozens of lighter anti-aircraft weapons, and a crew of approximately 1,700 men. She was propelled by 4 Bethlehem steel steam turbines, generating a combined 120,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 propeller shafts to a top speed of 33 knots. Those turbines were fed by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, operating at 600 pounds per square inch of steam pressure. 600 pounds per square inch is not an abstraction. It is a measurement of stored energy sufficient to drive 17,000 tons of steel through the ocean at 33 knots. It is also a measurement of what happens when the system containing that energy is breached by enemy fire. The engineering spaces on a heavy cruiser during combat operations were not merely uncomfortable. They were among the most dangerous work environments that industrial civilization had ever placed human beings inside. The men who maintained those boilers worked in spaces where ambient temperatures routinely exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit during tropical operations. Not 130 degrees at the hottest point near the boiler casing, 130 degrees as the general ambient temperature of the space. The men working immediately adjacent to the boiler casings and steam lines were working in temperatures that could exceed 160 degrees Fahrenheit during high-speed maneuvers when all 8 boilers were online simultaneously. Heat stroke in that environment was not a rare event. It was a recurring operational problem that the Navy addressed through rotation schedules that were, in practice, impossible to maintain during combat. A damage control party, trying to restore power to a flooded engineering space after a torpedo hit, was not going to rotate out of a 140-degree compartment every 20 minutes because the doctrine said they should. They were going to stay until the job was done or until they couldn't stand anymore. The practical consequences of that reality showed up in the medical records. when the medical records survived. Sleep was the first thing the Navy took from cruiser crews, and it took it systematically. A heavy cruiser at sea in a combat zone maintained 3-section watch rotations. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off. That is the official schedule. The 8 hours off did not mean 8 hours of sleep. It meant 8 hours during which you were not formally required to be at your battle station. It did not mean you could sleep through general quarters. It did not mean you could sleep through refueling operations, when all hands were required to handle lines and hoses. It did not mean you could sleep through the daily maintenance requirements that kept 17,000 tons of machinery functional. In practice, cruiser crew members operating during the Guadalcanal campaign, the Marianas campaign, and the Okinawa campaign averaged between 4 and 5 hours of sleep per 24-hour period during sustained operations. That figure comes from the diaries and letters of crew members, cross-referenced with ship's logs and action reports from the period. The Navy's own post-war studies of crew performance confirmed it. What 4 hours of sleep per day does to human cognitive function is documented thoroughly in the scientific literature that didn't exist yet when these men were living it. After 72 hours of sustained sleep restriction to 4 hours per night, reaction time degrades to the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.08%. After 96 hours, that equivalence rises to 0.10%. The men tracking incoming Japanese aircraft on radar scopes, the men calculating fire control solutions for 8-inch guns, the men monitoring boiler pressure gauges and steam temperature readouts, were doing those jobs with brains that were physiologically impaired. Not because they lacked discipline or dedication, because human biology has requirements that naval doctrine cannot override. The gunners who stood watch at 5-inch anti-aircraft mounts during the long Pacific nights were not just tired. They were operating at a sustained level of cognitive impairment that would have disqualified them from driving an automobile in peacetime. And they were doing it while tracking fast-moving targets at night with fire control systems that required precise manual inputs, in seas that routinely rolled the ship 15 to 20 degrees off vertical. The physical environment below decks on a heavy cruiser was a sustained assault on the human body that went far beyond heat and sleep deprivation. Fresh water on a cruiser was rationed with a precision that most crew members found difficult to comprehend before they experienced it. The ship's evaporators could produce approximately 35,000 gallons of fresh water per day under ideal conditions. Ideal conditions at sea in a combat zone were rare. Evaporator capacity dropped when the machinery was under stress, when sea conditions were rough, when maintenance had been deferred because there wasn't time for it. The practical fresh water allocation for a crew of 1,700 men during extended Pacific operations ran to roughly 10 gallons per man per day. 10 gallons covers cooking and minimal drinking requirements. It does not cover bathing, not in any meaningful sense. Navy regulations permitted crew members on extended operations to use salt water for all bathing purposes, with fresh water reserved for drinking and cooking only. In the tropical Pacific, where air temperatures commonly exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit and engineering spaces ran 40 degrees above that, men sweating through 12-hour watch rotations were permitted to wash in salt water and told to make do. Saltwater bathing, without fresh water rinsing, sustained over weeks of tropical deployment, produces a specific category of skin pathology. The Navy's medical literature of the period uses the clinical terminology: tropical dermatitis, saltwater boils, fungal infections exacerbated by persistent skin moisture and salt crystal irritation. The crew members described it differently in their letters home, the ones that made it past the censors. They described skin that cracked and bled where it bent. They described sores that would not heal because the moment any healing began, another watch rotation in 130-degree engineering spaces reopened everything. They described the particular misery of trying to sleep with open sores against a canvas bunk in a berthing compartment that was never, under any operational circumstances, cool. The food situation was its own separate category of degradation. A cruiser's commissary was provisioned for 60-day deployments at the standard Navy ration of approximately 3,400 calories per man per day. Fresh provisions lasted roughly the first 2 weeks. After that, the diet was canned meat, powdered eggs, beans, rice, and whatever the bakers could produce from flour that had been stored in tropical humidity long enough to develop weevil infestations. The standing order regarding weevil-infested flour was to sift it and use it anyway, because there was no alternative. Men performing heavy physical labor in extreme heat on a diet averaging 2,800 calories during the final weeks of a deployment lost weight at rates that would be classified as a medical emergency in any peacetime setting. The weight loss was accompanied by vitamin deficiencies that produced symptoms the medical officer noted clinically and could do essentially nothing about. There were no vitamin supplements in sufficient quantity. There was no way to address a vitamin C deficiency in a man 30 days out of port except to get him back to port, and the operational schedule did not permit that. The medical care available aboard a heavy cruiser in 1942 and 1943 was, by the standards of what the men needed, inadequate in ways that the official records tend to minimize through careful use of clinical language. A Baltimore-class cruiser carried a medical department consisting of one medical officer, typically a lieutenant or lieutenant commander who had completed a standard medical residency before commissioning, 2 or 3 dental officers, and a staff of hospital corpsmen. The ship's sickbay was equipped for routine medical care and for stabilizing casualties well enough to transfer them to a fleet hospital or hospital ship when one was available. It was not a hospital. It was not staffed or equipped to perform complex surgery, to manage multiple simultaneous critical casualties, or to provide the level of trauma care that combat wounds frequently required. The mortality statistics for specific wound categories aboard cruisers during the Pacific campaign tell the story more precisely than any description can. For penetrating abdominal wounds severe enough to require surgery, shipboard mortality ran between 65% and 80%, depending on the specific action and the time elapsed between wounding and treatment. For burns covering more than 30% of body surface area, mortality exceeded 85%. For traumatic amputations, mortality from hemorrhage and shock before definitive surgical care could be reached ran at approximately 50%. These were not statistics that reflected surgical incompetence or insufficient effort. They reflected the fundamental impossibility of providing adequate trauma care in a compartment the size of a large office, under fire, while the ship was maneuvering at 30 knots. The dental situation had its own particular brutality. Dental care on a cruiser consisted of extractions performed under local anesthesia by dental officers working with standard instruments in conditions that were, during combat operations, frequently interrupted by general quarters alarms. There were no fillings. There was no prophylaxis beyond what the individual crew member could manage with the toothbrush and tooth powder in his personal kit. After 6 months of deployment on a diet heavy in refined carbohydrates, salt, and canned goods, with irregular sleep, chronic stress, and no preventive dental care, cavity rates among enlisted men approached 80%. Men were requesting tooth extractions because the pain was interfering with their ability to stand watch. The dental officers were performing extractions in numbers that, under peacetime conditions, would have been considered evidence of a public health emergency. Then there was the fire. Any discussion of what it meant to serve aboard a heavy cruiser in World War II has to eventually confront the specific nature of what happened when things went wrong. Because on cruisers in the Pacific, things went wrong constantly and catastrophically. A 17,000-ton heavy cruiser carried, at full combat load, approximately 1,700 rounds of 8-inch ammunition, 5,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, hundreds of rounds of lighter caliber anti-aircraft ammunition, aviation gasoline for the ship's floatplanes, fuel oil for propulsion in quantities measured in hundreds of thousands of gallons, and torpedo warheads in ships that carried torpedo tubes. Each of these represented a specific category of fire and explosion risk. In combination, they represented a ship that was, from a fire safety perspective, a structure that would have been condemned as uninhabitable under peacetime industrial safety codes. The 8-inch gun turrets were pressurized with air to prevent powder gas from entering the handling spaces below during firing. The powder used in 8-inch projectile charges was propellant powder, not explosive. But the distinction became largely academic when a Japanese armor-piercing bomb penetrated a turret and detonated inside the handling room where powder charges were staged for loading. The resulting fire produced temperatures sufficient to cause steel structural members to fail. It produced blast pressures sufficient to collapse adjacent compartments. It produced, in ships where the flooding control and fire suppression systems had been damaged by the same hit that started the fire, a cascading failure sequence that the damage control parties had limited ability to interrupt. USS New Orleans, a heavy cruiser, had her bow blown off by a torpedo at the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942. The torpedo detonated her forward magazines. The bow section separated cleanly from the rest of the ship at frame 30. The forward 170 feet of the ship simply ceased to exist as part of the ship and sank separately. New Orleans survived because the flooding was contained aft of the magazine explosion, and because her damage control parties were extraordinarily effective. She eventually reached Tulagi under her own power, which was a remarkable achievement that partially obscures how catastrophically the ship had been damaged. USS Minneapolis, at the same battle, had her bow blown off to a similar extent by a second torpedo. USS Pensacola was hit in her after engine room. The torpedo ignited aviation gasoline and fuel oil. She was on fire for 7 hours before the fires were brought under control. She lost 125 men. The Battle of Tassafaronga was, by the metrics of ships damaged and casualties inflicted, an American disaster. The Japanese destroyer force under Raizo Tanaka sank 1 heavy cruiser and put 3 others out of action for months, losing exactly 1 destroyer in return. The American cruisers had radar, they had more guns, they had numerical superiority. They lost anyway. And the men inside those ships paid the specific, physical, irreversible price for a tactical doctrine that placed them in a night engagement against an enemy who had spent a decade preparing for exactly this kind of fight. The specific experience of being inside a cruiser when it was hit, as recorded in the survivor testimonies and action reports, deserves more direct attention than the official histories typically provide. A Japanese Type 93 torpedo, the Long Lance, carried a warhead of 1,080 pounds of high explosive. The weapon ran at 49 knots. Its impact against a cruiser's hull was not a penetration in the sense that the word implies gradual entry. The warhead detonated after penetrating the hull plating, expanding explosive gases in a fraction of a second, faster than steel could flex to absorb the energy. The result was a structural failure event, spanning 40 to 80 feet of the ship's length, depending on where the detonation occurred relative to structural frames and internal bulkheads. The men in the compartments adjacent to the detonation point experienced a pressure wave that ruptured eardrums, collapsed lungs, and caused internal hemorrhage without any external wound visible to the casual observer. The men in the compartments directly at the detonation point experienced something that the medical records describe in the passive voice, in clinical language, in the way that language retreats from describing things for which there are no adequate words. The men who were not killed immediately by the blast, who were wounded or trapped or thrown against structure by the explosion, were in a compartment that was now flooding. A cruiser hit amidships by a Long Lance began flooding the affected engineering spaces immediately. The flooding rates in a compartment with a 40-foot structural failure along the hull were not rates that damage control parties could address with portable pumps and shoring timbers. The flooding was measured in tons per minute. The men in those spaces had, in some cases, seconds to decide whether to attempt escape or attempt to fight flooding that could not be fought. The damage control doctrine required them to fight the flooding first and evacuate only if the flooding became uncontrollable. The practical definition of uncontrollable in a torpedo hit amidships on a cruiser was frequently reached before the damage control party had finished assessing the situation. Men drowned in engineering spaces of ships that did not sink, trapped in flooded compartments that flooding had made inaccessible to rescue from other parts of the ship. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is documented in the action reports and casualty investigations of specific ships in specific engagements throughout the Pacific Campaign. The Kamikaze Campaign of 1944 and 1945 introduced a category of threat that cruiser crews experienced as qualitatively different from anything that had come before it. Not morally different, not in terms of danger, but psychologically different in ways that the men who survived it described consistently. A conventional air attack gave the ship something to work with. The aircraft had a course, a speed, an altitude. The fire control computers could generate a solution. The 5-inch guns could put up a barrage. The 40mm and 20mm mounts could engage at close range. There was a technical problem to be solved, and the training existed to solve it, imperfectly, with cost, but with the possibility of success built into the engagement. A kamikaze pilot had already solved the accuracy problem by removing accuracy as a variable. He did not need to release a bomb at precisely the right moment, from precisely the right altitude and airspeed. He needed to point his aircraft at the ship and fly it there. The fire control solution that American gunners had trained for years to execute was optimized for a target that was trying to survive. It was not optimized for a target that had already decided not to. Cruiser crews at Okinawa described watching kamikaze attacks develop with a specific kind of dread that conventional air attacks did not produce. With a conventional attack, the aircraft turned away after the bomb release. There was a moment where the crew knew the immediate threat was past. With a kamikaze, there was no such moment. The aircraft kept coming. The crew could watch it absorb hits, watch pieces of it come off, watch it continue on its course through all of that, because the man inside it was not trying to escape. He had made a decision that the fire from the ship's guns could not reverse. USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser, was sunk by a Japanese submarine on July 30th, 1945, after delivering the components of the first atomic bomb to Tinian. She sank in 12 minutes. Of 1,196 crew members, 900 made it into the water. 4 days passed before rescue arrived, because the ship's arrival at Leyte Gulf was not reported as overdue due to a failure in the Navy's port arrival tracking system. Of the 900 men who entered the water, 316 were rescued. The remainder died from shark attacks, exposure, dehydration, drowning, and the specific madness that prolonged exposure and dehydration produce in human beings who have been in the ocean for 4 days and have watched those around them die, one by one. The sharks were bull sharks and oceanic whitetips. The oceanic whitetip is now recognized by marine biologists as one of the most dangerous shark species in open ocean conditions, specifically because of its behavior around floating objects and groups of survivors in the water. The men of Indianapolis had 4 days to learn that in the most direct way possible. By the end of the Pacific War, the United States Navy had lost 10 heavy cruisers and light cruisers to enemy action, with dozens more severely damaged and temporarily withdrawn from service. The casualty figures across the cruiser force ran to thousands of men killed in ship sinkings alone, before accounting for the men killed in individual engagements on ships that survived. The men who served on those ships came from everywhere, from Iowa and Massachusetts and California and Georgia. They came from farms and factories and high schools and colleges. The average enlisted man on a heavy cruiser in 1942 was 20 years old, had completed high school but not college, and had been in the Navy for less than 18 months when he first saw combat. He had been trained extensively on the technical operation of his battle station. He had been trained almost not at all on what it would actually feel like to be inside a steel hull when a 1,080-pound warhead detonated against it. There was no training for that, because there was no adequate way to train for it. There was only the experience itself, and the way the experience changed the men who had it, and the way those men carried it home afterward in their silences as much as in their words. The Navy classified destroyers as highly survivable in 1942. It classified cruisers as capital combatants with substantial reserve buoyancy and robust damage control capabilities. These classifications were accurate in the narrow, technical sense that cruisers were harder to sink than destroyers and easier to sink than battleships. They did not address what it was like to be the 1,700 men inside when Japanese torpedoes began testing those capabilities in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands at night. The official histories record the ships. They record the tonnage and the engagement dates and the tactical outcomes and the decorations awarded. They record what the ships did. They are considerably less precise about what the ships cost, measured not in dollars or displacement tons, but in the specific, granular, irreversible currency of what was asked of the men inside them, and what those men paid. The ship's log of a cruiser is a technical document. It records speed and heading and weather conditions and the times that general quarters was called and secured. It does not record what it felt like to be a 20-year-old from Iowa at a 5-inch gun mount at 2 in the morning in the slot, watching a radar contact close from 45 miles to 30 miles to 15 miles in the darkness, knowing that the range at which the Japanese destroyers would launch their long lance torpedoes was approximately 10 miles. Knowing that the torpedo would arrive before the ship could do anything useful about it, and standing the watch anyway, because standing the watch was what you were there to do. The ship's log does not record that. The men who stood those watches recorded it in letters that didn't always make it through the censors, in diaries that some of them kept despite the regulations against it, in the specific, careful silences they maintained for the rest of their lives on the subject of certain nights in certain waters in a war that ended 80 years ago. It is worth trying to understand what those silences contained, not because understanding changes anything about what happened, but because the men who stood those watches in those conditions deserved then, and deserve now, to have the reality of what they endured stated directly, without the comfortable distance of official language and tactical summary. Life on a World War II cruiser was not a difficult posting with occasional danger. It was a sustained physical and psychological ordeal, conducted inside a machine that the enemy was actively trying to destroy, crewed by men who were chronically sleep-deprived and underfed, and operating in temperatures that would constitute an occupational health violation in any peacetime industrial setting, with medical care that was inadequate to the wounds they were sustaining, in waters where survival after sinking was measured in hours rather than days. That is the accurate description. That is what the ship's log does not say, and what the official histories tend to soften. That is what the men who came home from it knew in their bodies and their minds for the rest of their lives.